Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we help you notice and diffuse what's going on with yourself that's getting in the way of healthy connection. You know, we've all got coping mechanisms and reactivity and triggers that block our well-being, but they also block healthy relationships. Not just relationship with other people, but they block a healthy relationship with yourself and maybe most poignantly, with God. So we help you notice and diffuse those dynamics so that you can become human-sized. You know, one of the great distinctives of reactivity and triggers is they tend to make you forget the Lord. Anxiety has a gospel and it says it's all on you and you have to do it. And suddenly you realize you're no longer aware of God's presence. So every week on Being Human, we just pause and we light a candle and we just relax into God's presence together, remembering that God is with us in it all. I'm thrilled to interview my guest today, Zach Meerkreebs. Zach's the author of the book Lower, Igniting Spiritual Awakening Through Radical Humility. Zach's also the young man that preached the sermon on February 8th of 2023 that launched the Asbury Outpouring. Maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't. Asbury Seminary and College is a Bible college and seminary in Kentucky where they have chapel like most colleges do. And just on any other day, any typical chapel, they had a doctoral student, Zach Meerkreebs, come up and preach a sermon like always. But something happened and a form of a revival broke out, what they call an outpouring. And over the next 18 days, 80,000 people flocked to Asbury Seminary to witness what God was doing in that intense and short amount of time. You know, people have a lot of questions about revival and outpourings and evidence of the Holy Spirit. We get into that with Zach. We ask him how he knew that God was at work. What was the evidence of it? But my favorite thing about this conversation with Zach was the bewilderment. You're going to meet a guy who is bewildered by what God is doing. And I just came away from this conversation. I'm excited to share it with you, just reflecting on the power of gratitude and the power of wonder. And maybe the invitation for all of us to take a look around this week for what God's doing. You know, it's not always as spectacular or overt as was with Asbury. Sometimes it's the still small voice. Sometimes you have to hunt around for it. But that invitation to be bewildered by the Lord, to relax into God's grandness and sovereignty. This interview, I just began by asking Zach, what was it like to preach the sermon that launched this outpouring? Let's take a look now.
So February 8th was a mandatory ordinary chapel service. Even in my own journey, which we could unpack some of, wanting to be excellent and blow the hair back of college students and not feeling capable of doing that this morning because of just life and a young baby who wasn't sleeping. And I just felt like the Lord asked us to stick to Romans 12, 9 through 21, and really kind of just exegetically walk through that passage. And I actually ran out of time in the sermon and clicked through the last 7 slides of my sermon to a slide that ultimately invited students to, we can't authentically love one another, which is that first verse, verse 9 of chapter 12. Let your love be without hypocrisy. We can't do that until we authentically experience the love of God ourselves. So I said, hey, I have coffee at 1:30 with a student, but if you'd like to stay and experience the love of God, I'll be, and if you need prayer, I'll be on the front row till about 1:30. So I stepped off stage, and we had a heroic gospel choir, honestly, who carried so much weight that day. And, that's even a story in itself of what God did at Asbury, a predominantly white school, having this beautiful, vibrant gospel choir lead worship during the first hours and the first days and really throughout the outpouring. But I really got off stage and I texted my wife and said that I had laid a stinker, that I didn't feel like my sermon went well, and that I would be home soon for a nap. And then, an hour later, I'm like, these kids won't leave. And then 2 hours later, I'm like, God's really doing something. I think I'm going to skip coffee and stay. And then 4 hours later, I'm like weeping on a voice memo to my wife, asking her to get our daughters and bring them to Asbury as soon as possible. And 16 days later, we had about 80,000 people converge on a 2 traffic light town, and the world had heard about this thing called Asbury Outpouring, and our life has changed quite a bit.
So the obvious story here is what it's like to be part of a supernatural movement that just takes on a life of its own. Before we get to that, Zach, some of our audience are pastors. Most of our audience are not pastors. They may be surprised to hear that it's typical for a preacher to preach a sermon and then immediately go into regret and shame.
Yes,
Before
exactly.
we get to the supernatural outpouring, tell us what that's experienced like for maybe our audience that are not as familiar. Maybe our audience even sits under a pastor that looks so confident, but then they do tend to walk backstage or off stage. What's that like for you?
It's always the most vulnerable, tender moments um, in my ministry life. Whether it's, oh, I didn't share that the way I wanted, or I didn't get to time, and then, oh, did anyone like it? And it really is this like bowl of noodles of like, should I even care? And then you feel ashamed that you care about what they think, and it's very normal. And actually, since those days, and over the last almost 2 years now of traveling and speaking and telling stories, I'm now using time after I preach substantially more intentionally than when I do before. Because there's this like culture of people that preach, they go hide away and do something super spiritual. Or we talk about the green room where everyone's quiet and can get zoned in. Now I'm way more relaxed before. And now I have to be super intentional after, because the best thing I can offer someone when I travel and speak is how I act at dinner that night, or how I receive people at the altar for prayer. And if I'm worried about, did I nail it, then I'm not present with the mom who lost their child. Or so I've asked for more time before I come back out. But this very reality has impacted my practice now, because it is super tender. I don't know if you would relate.
Very much. My habit is to prepare, never feel like I'm quite ready, then preach, struggle to tell the difference between the Holy Spirit and adrenaline, and
Mm-hmm.
then repent, usually like regret of
Yeah,
some kind. And then when people are moved and they want to engage, managing my own adrenal response so I can stay deeply connected. As you said, when people are offering their vulnerability and their pain, I find that to be an essential skill, and it is
yeah,
difficult when you're busy regretting what you said, or as you texting your
exactly.
wife, laying a stinker and wondering if
Yeah.
anything will happen.
One of the best books I read later, I've been in ministry for about 13 years. One of the best books I read was Adrenaline and Stress by Archibald Hart. And it does not have like a cool title or cover. It looks like, but um, yeah, Matthew 7 says you don't throw pearls to swine or holy things to dogs. And I realized, because I wasn't stewarding my emotions, I was treating a lot of pearls like I was a pig or a dog, because I was so worried about myself in that moment.
Yeah.
So I've actually been really blessed by a lot of your work on how I can differentiate in that moment and take a deep breath and be present. But it takes time now. I can't go straight there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back to that sermon. You preach the message, you call students to not leave until they've had some kind of experiential encounter with the love of God. I got the privilege of watching the sermon. We'll put a link in the show notes, but it's
Oh,
on
cool.
YouTube. Anyone can watch it. You even challenged, seniors, don't graduate until you have this encounter. It's going to be so important if you're proclaiming God's love to experience it yourself. And then my understanding is many of the students did, in fact, leave. It was only a handful that stayed. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'll have to send you a video. Maybe you guys can share it. I have a video 20 minutes after, and it's just 19 students, and they've kind of scooted up to the first couple rows. And then my friend George Dumaine, who was leading worship, there was no instruments. He was just singing over them. And and then what was beautiful was that within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you heard people trickling in and hearing people walk into the balcony. Or one of my roles on that campus is I'm a volunteer soccer coach. So um, I started seeing guys on the soccer team who I've been praying for to experience the love of God and give their lives to the Lord poke their heads back in because chapel was still going. And group chats and texts were blowing up like God was doing something in the chapel. So by about 4 o'clock, leaders came back, and the president sent an email to the school that God was moving. And then by that evening, we decided to keep the chapel open through the night. I got to go up and announce, and everyone went. So many people went and got mattresses out of their dorm rooms and hammocks to hang between things, and they just moved in, and it's remarkable.
Mm. Zach, in 2004, I got to go get a life plan, which is kind of like a 2-day counseling intensive, sorting out God's call on your life. And Pete, the life plan facilitator, he asked me a question about every time in my life that something big happened where I knew in the moment my life's going to shift. In my case, for example, I was in a life-threatening car accident when I was a teenager. And even in the car accident, I thought, this is going to change my life. And in many ways, God used it to call me into ministry. This for you was a life-changing, this swung a gate in your life. What's it like to have your life changed like that? Can you put words to that for us?
Yeah, to be really honest, it's not a very sparkly word or impressive word. Part of our story, Steve, is we lost our middle daughter 3.5 years ago. And, losing Esther was visceral, searing, acute pain. But I would say this has been more disorienting. Like losing Esther, I could put my head down and like make sure Eden, my oldest, got fed and got to bed, and KP, my wife, was getting taken care of, and I could answer emails, and there was a counselor, and there was books I could read. But there's really no books out there, and um, friendships have changed. The people, 2 years ago, I wasn't on podcasts, and now that's a part of my life. Um, the places I've been invited to speak, or and that's one reason why I've loved wrestling through the stuff that you write about and this podcast is about, because, and I don't want to like be cheesy, but it's like this, when I look at what God's doing and so many people are longing for revival and renewal, I'm like, I don't know anything about that, but I know how to take care of your heart and how to be like a resilient vessel for God to use. And I just kind of now in this disorientation have to throw out an appointment or a trip that feels overwhelming and just say, okay, how can I stay like resilient and have my center of gravity be as driven low as possible and fight for fun so I'm not taking myself too serious. But the word would be disorienting for sure. It's been a lot harder than um a lot harder and confusing than I thought.
In your list of disorientations, you mentioned that friendships have changed. What made your friendships change?
Yeah, I think feeling being able to relate, um, not knowing, because of how jolting and and somewhat supernatural things were. I have dear friends that I love and that think the whole thing is made up, and I honor them and I love them, but that's not my experience. I don't. If I made this up, I would have done a lot better. But that's really hard, you know. Those are people that have walked with us, or our life. My wife is a forensic pediatric nurse practitioner. She has a full, heavy, intense calling that I champion. She's a superhero. And after this call, I head to the airport and I'm in Europe for 10 days. And that's new. And that's, I think, an assignment from the Lord. I hope that I'm being obedient, but that does change relationships, you know.
Yeah. Your book where you
Yeah.
capture this story, the book's called Lower, Ignite Spiritual Awakening Through Radical Humility. You were mentioning this kind of gravitational force, this passion to try to stay grounded and rooted. It's not just your humility, Zach. Of course, talking about your humility is a bit of a paradox. If I ask
It's
you about,
terrifying.
how humble you are, and you say, "Oh, I'm just so humble," it's amazing. But what you're really also talking about is the way that the students and the faculty stewarded this experience as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I think that's one of the distinctives of the Asbury Outpouring is the way the whole community really carefully treated it.
Yeah. I think, a conversation on humility is always terrifying, right? It's like, I think it's Tim Keller writes, humility is shy. As soon as you start talking about it, it disappears.
Yeah.
But I think sobriety is a good friend of humility. I think to be sober minded requires a humility to understand what's going on and the weight of it. And when you're drunk by the opportunity, you're usually operating in pride of like, what can I get from this? And I deserve this and you deserve that. But I think sobriety causes us to operate in humility. And I just saw a room and an organization in a little town be very sober minded with what was deposited there. So there wasn't a flippancy. There wasn't, they took all the giving options off the website, because they were sober minded by what that could mean and what that could be perceived. We didn't, and now we only introduced ourselves by our first names. So, like, one of the most heroic leaders that I still think is maybe the case study of adaptive leadership that I could point to anyone to is a guy named Kevin. And he introduced himself as Kevin. And if you didn't know, you wouldn't know that he's the president of Asbury University. Because Kevin stood up and said, "Hey, I'm Kevin. I work here." And because there's a sobriety to I don't want to take any glory away from what Jesus is doing here. So I think a room stepped up in sobriety, and then at this level of mutual difference, mutual submission to one another, that it goes back to that Romans 12 passage of like, how do you topple over one another and giving each other honor, not topple over one another to gain platform. And we just saw that. And it was so flesh burning and so difficult. The 16 days of leadership was the hardest 16 days of leadership I've ever experienced. And there's still people that are feeling it. I still feel it. But the sobriety of what we are stewarding caused us to get as low as we can to the ground in humility and understanding of our brokenness. But I think sobriety was what I sensed across, whether you were checking in a reporter from the New York Times or the gym teacher from the local middle school. It was just sober minded because of what we were stewarding.
I've got 3 children, and one of them is on the other side of college. He's now working as a nurse, and my middle son is in Bible college in Phoenix. My daughter's still at home with us. You could look at that college age group of kids, idealistic, 150% passion. We're all going to change the world. I see this in my boys. I'm an old fella. I'm in my 50s. I remember that stage of life. I think some people could look at what happened at Asbury and say, well, that was just the passion of college age kids. But I think you have a different testimony than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the story I think of often is how underwhelmed college students were. I remember being at the door at times, ushering, a van from one of the schools would come. We had over almost, I think, around 300 universities come during those 16 days. And I remember ushering students in and then being terribly disappointed and then quickly overwhelmed by the presence of God. And it reminds me of the Emmaus Road story of these people are just bummed. These two men are just bummed, and they have no clue that Jesus is walking through, and they're underwhelmed. And then they're like, "Oh my goodness, our hearts were on fire." So I think the analog nature of it, the simplicity of it, proves some of that zeal is like maybe more pure. That it wasn't we didn't spin the wheel that just kept on spinning, but they were encountering Jesus and the same in the same way of like, man, I'm if I'm gonna look at Gen Z and say, what are you zealous for? Because all generations are zealous for something. It might be for a beautiful home and a white picket fence, or it might be a certain kind of economics. Like, if they're zealous for encountering Jesus, then I don't blame them. And I wish other generations were more zealous for encountering Jesus. So there's somewhat of like, yeah, what we're seeing on the university campus through ministries uh, that are seeing hundreds of people get baptized, and worship, and repent, and what we saw at Asbury, and what we're seeing around the world. There is a part of like, maybe that is a renewal of zeal for the right thing. So I don't want to totally fault and demonize the concept of zeal either. Um, but I think if you got into the room, you would realize that it was quite underwhelming. Um, besides the overwhelming experience of experiencing Christ's character.
I think our charismatic sisters and brothers would call this the manifest presence of God. God is
Ooh,
always with us, yes, but there are these particular times. You just described, Zach, that, okay, at first it was underwhelming and then you encounter God's presence. Can you help us? What did that feel like for you?
yeah, no, that's super helpful. Thank you. Um, I think a lot of people came to Asbury expecting like a demonstrative experience, and even I'm not a revival or awakening person. I've just in the last year or so I had to start reading because they asked me questions and I'm like, I have no clue what you're talking. I was a Jewish kid who gave his life to Christ. I don't know.
Sorry to interrupt, Zach, but my understanding is, weren't you a Jewish kid who then became a Christian Missionary Alliance? Hey, I love my CMA brothers and sisters. I work with a number of them, but not known for their wild, charismatic outpourings.
Yeah, exactly.
Just checking.
Exactly. So I didn't know anything about this, but you do see, there was a move of God in Toronto that some people call the Toronto blessing.
Yeah.
And there was a real demonstrative experience of like joy that they would talk about spilling out in God in spiritual laughter. Or there's moves of God that you just, people are getting healed. I think what I appreciated about our experience at Asbury was it felt like the closest thing to experiencing the fruits of the Spirit tangibly. Like it wasn't demonstrative in the same way as other things that people maybe experience. Even the word revival, you might think of a tent meeting where people are falling out, getting blankets on them, or whatever. This felt like I experienced Christ's gentleness when I confessed, or there was like a supernatural, unexplainable joy, which is the fruit of the spirit, joy that isn't very charismatic, right? It's Galatians 5. It's Christ's character. Like there was a time where we were in a meeting, the leadership team was in a meeting, and we were talking about how so many people are just visiting with each other in Hughes Auditorium, laughing, enjoying each other. And how that must have been, how are we going to steward that and get them to move out of Hughes so they could be focused in worship and prayer, right? And then I remember one of the leaders said, "What if that's the charism? We're dealing with a lonely, isolated people, not just Gen Z." Quickly, after 3 or 4 days, Asbury was not a Gen Z event. Gen Z ushered in, but you know, it was not just Gen Z. And we saw like a charism, like a demonstration of the spirit was people enjoying each other and laughing and pastors apologizing to each other. And like that doesn't feel like a demonstrative uh exaggeration of anything as much as like Christ's character felt in on your flesh in relationships. So um that's how I've been experiencing him, is this is the expression of the fruits of the spirit, which is really exciting.
Oh, I love that. It's such a helpful and encouraging way to look at it. Zach, one of my all-time favorite movies is from the 1980s called Awakenings. It's not wildly well known, but Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, it's a stacked cast. It's one of Robin Williams' first very serious movies. He plays a highly introverted, brilliant doctor. He's very shy, uncomfortable around people, very different for Robin Williams, based on the true story of Oliver Sacks. Oliver
Wow.
Sacks was a doctor who was dealing with dozens of catatonic people. Their families would bring them into his ward and they'd live in his ward and they were all catatonic. And his job was to try to awaken them, figure out what medicine would unlock these catatonic people. He realized that their bodies were locked up, but their brain was still going. Anyway, it's very moving in the movie and at risk of spoiling it. However, a 1980s movie, I feel, we're safe to
You got
spoil. He successfully wakes them up. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful moment in the movie. And one by one, they slowly all go back to catatonic. And the soundtrack that's being played as they do, the soundtrack is called The Reality of Miracles. And it just occurs to me, Zach, that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and he died again. And Jesus healed the blind. And I bet that blind guy, I can't prove it, but I bet he did not die with 20/20 vision. In the same way, Asbury had this beautiful moment. And then at some point, it's not that it dissipates, but some version of what's next or normal comes back. I'd love to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, it took grieving, and I'm super grateful that I have an unbelievable counselor who actually drove from his office to meet with me 3 times during the 16 days. And we talk a lot about how Jesus did not come to cancel my creaturehood. He did not come to cancel my limits. I'm not a superhero, but he came to move within my creaturehood and redeem it. He came to operate within my limits and love me and love others through it. And just like at some point I needed to sleep or eat, the university needed to sleep and take a breath, and these students needed to breathe, and the city needed to breathe, because whatever you want to call it, outpouring, renewal, awakening, does not cancel our limits. And that's been something that I've had to learn for a long, long time in ministry and manhood, and definitely in this season. And I think when the time came, we knew some because like the streets couldn't, like the plumbing couldn't hold what had happened. The food, we have a Subway and a Chinese place. They were running out of food. You know, the I can send you this picture, but literally on the highway there was flashing signs saying "revival over capacity, turn around." Because we have limits, Steve, and Jesus doesn't come like I am Zach human, not Zach Superman. Even though I got to be a part of this thing, and I think the end was just an expression of our humanity. And I don't think Jesus was disappointed in it at all. I think a lot of us have learned more, as much as how it ended and what life looks like now as we did during the 16 days. And it was painful. And it is hard to be the guy who stood up and said, services are done. We can gimmick it. I remember so focused. We're not closing it. We're catalyzing. All the gimmicks. But people had bought tickets to fly across the world, and they showed up to a space where relatively nothing was happening anymore. We had to handle that. But I don't think Jesus is upset that I have limits. But that's been a journey for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the best things we can disciple these Gen Z students is like, it's okay. You have to go to school again. You came here for school. The cafeteria didn't have enough food. We got to catch up, So I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And on the flip side of this, I don't want to call it a return to normalcy. It's really more that you went into this experience and now you are out the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have two communities, Zach. You have your Kentucky family that went through it together,
Yeah.
Kevin and students and so on. But then, as you said, you get on a plane and you now fly all over the world and you're bringing a taste of this experience to people who are so hungry for some kind of encounter with God. Um, I'd love to hear what that's like.
Yeah. Um, Numbers 13 and 14 is the perfect example. And it's ministered to me as I've done this is there's 12 spies and 10 spies came back and gave a pretty negative report of what they saw. The walls are big, the giants are huge, the soil is fertile, but we're in no luck. And then Joshua and Caleb said the walls are fortified, the giants are huge, the land is good, and God said it's going to be ours. And in a world of 10 spy reports, I get to be one of the 2 spies given a different report. And that's a lot of what I get to do is just, I think I preach and think a lot about Galatians 6:9. Do not grow weary in doing good, for in due time you'll reap what you sow if you don't lose heart. And some days I bet when Joshua and Caleb were like 10 years in to still wandering, they probably needed to like grab coffee and be like, were we idiots? Like, do we mean what we said when we gave report? So I still have to call some of my friends and be like, will I ever see that again? Or was that just whatever? And we usually encourage each other and we go. But I think one of the greatest things, I was actually just processing this. I got to go to a gathering in Nashville, and the prayer I've been praying is that they would see me like Acts 4, an ordinary, uneducated person that had been with Jesus. Or like I've been living in 1 Corinthians 2. I don't come to you with superiority of speech or wisdom, but in giving God's testimony, I've forgotten everything besides Christ crucified, so you are not confident in me. but in a full demonstration of Spirit. So when I go to London tonight, I want to be more concerned about how I deliver the message than the actual message I give. Or then when I head to Berlin, I want to be faithful in the message I give, but I want to be a witness to what Jesus did by the how I deliver the message. And then how do I come home and delight in bedtime and mac and cheese just as much as the steak dinner someone takes me out to in Berlin? I don't know. Or, I still light my candle and sit in a blue chair I ordered offline. I don't have like some throne because of the outpouring. My prayer closet is the closet under the stairs. It's not that special. I got the furniture from Costco, you know? And I think that actually will encourage the global church, that you don't have to be extraordinary. In fact, quite ordinary and unremarkable. I sometimes tell people, if you only knew. And that's my heart as we go around the world.
Well, Zach, I think one of my favorite things about you is your bewilderment. You
Yeah.
are bewildered that God has used you in this way, and yet you're saying yes and going for it. And I could understand, if I were to put myself in your shoes, I could understand why, having experienced a remarkable move of God, I might think that I'm exempt from the being human gauntlet. Out of all of the people, maybe I would not have to endure the gauntlet. I'm here to tell you, I'm so sorry. Being part of the Asbury Outpouring does not, in fact, exempt you from the being human gauntlet. So without further ado, I wish to
Well
inform
done.
you some questions here. We're going to break these questions. These are just questions focused on your relationship with yourself and your relationship with God. Real simple. We'll skip the human relationships. Um, what do you think you need that you don't really need?
What do I think I need that I don't really need? Um, it's a good question. I would say I often um, feel like I need more information and permission and sign offs than I really need, because I don't want to offend or step on toes. But often I need to go for it, and I need to not have paralysis by analysis.
Very good. What's a recurring statement your inner critic tells you?
You tricked them. You like wooed or manipulated your way. That this is, if they really knew, they wouldn't. Um, yeah, I have lots of things my inner critic tells me I could keep on going.
That's great. But related to that, Zach, um, this is more practical, similar kind of lane there. But what's one way that you treat others that if you started to treat yourself that same way, your life would be better?
I believe I do a good job at helping people feel safe and that they don't owe me anything. That you're really welcome. No strings attached. And I think if I lived that way, that I belong and I don't have to prove myself, I would, or pay my way. There's not an entry fee.
Okay. Let's talk about your relationship with God, which is inexplicably linked to your relationship to yourself. This was my big aha moment a few years ago when I realized, oh my goodness, my capacity to experience God's love is linked to my treatment of myself. Maybe you'd be willing to fill in the gap for us on this one. What if I were as blank to myself as God is to me?
Kind.
Okay. All right. Two more to go. You are sailing through the gauntlet. Two more questions. When the local church is at its best, what's something that it offers that you can't get anywhere else?
Christ's character on display.
Okay. And then
Yeah, the
finally, Zach.
prophetic. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, the prophetic statement of how they live out Christ's character is uniquely manifest when believers come together. You know, whether it's to care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, whether it's the integrity that doesn't make sense in a world that doesn't have the same kind of integrity. Marriages, not every marriage in the local church is perfect, but there's certain things that are uniquely held by the gathered Christians that display Christ's witness, unlike anything else.
I love that. All right, final question. When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Mm. I am so grateful that I've never felt closer to my wife. A lot of people, as travel began and platform grew, or meeting these people are just like, how's your marriage? How's your parenting? And I have felt more loved and safe and known by my wife as I share my insecurities and I share, something my wife is really good at is I can be really excited to know someone, or I can be really excited that someone emailed me, and I don't have to then prove to her that I'm still humble. Does that make sense? Like when I get when I got connected to you, I didn't have to go explain to her that, hey, don't worry, I'm not getting a big head, but I get to talk to Steve Cuss. And because you deeply ministered to me, Steve, through your writing, or if, I get to go to London. Like someone's paying for me to go to London, and I don't have to worry about what Kristen thinks when I'm like, man, I get to go. They want me to come speak. And I can be really yucky and safe with her, but I can also be really excited about something and not have to explain my way to make sure she knows my motives, because I'm just known by her. I don't hide. So I experienced Jesus a lot through how my wife loves me.
I suspect at the end of the day, we're two bewildered people, Zach. I too cannot believe that I get to do what I do. And it's equally bewildering to me when people are keen to meet me. I understand that my ministry in one word is relief. That's what I'm trying to bring. So I understand why if people feel relieved from pressure that they appreciate it. But it's an incredible privilege for both of us to get to do the work we do. My guest has been Zach Meerkreebs. His wonderful book, Lower, Igniting Spiritual Awakening Through Radical Humility. I think my whole audience, Zach, can tell that you are the living embodiment of what you're writing about in this book. Thanks so much for joining us on Being Human.
Thank you so much.